My dad raised me alone, but I still left him. Sometimes, memories come in flashes like lightning on a dark horizon, leaving you momentarily blinded by their brightness before they're swallowed by shadows again. That's how I remember my childhood, not as a continuous stream, but as moments of clarity, sharp and defined, amidst the blur of years. The smell of motor oil clings to many of those memories. It's what Dad always smelled like, especially when he came home after long days at the auto repair shop. He'd walk through the door, wiping his hands on a rag, his face always streaked with grease. I remember his smile, crooked and tired, but always there. That smile held us together more than anything else. Dad wasn't the talkative type. He spoke with actions, not words. When I was little, he'd leave me notes tucked in my lunch bag, reminders to finish my homework or to be good. Those notes were scrawled in his messy handwriting, like he was always in a rush. But I liked them. They were Dad's way of checking in, letting me know he cared. Even now, years later, I can see his penmanship in my mind, the way his letters leaned to the right, as though they, too, were in a hurry to get somewhere. He raised me alone, and I think it took everything he had to do it. I can't remember my mother. She left when I was barely old enough to talk. Dad never spoke about her, and I never asked. She was like a ghost that haunted our home, but we both ignored her presence. Maybe it was easier that way. Growing up, I knew we were different from other families. I saw the way people looked at us when Dad showed up to school events, always late and still in his work clothes, smelling of gasoline and sweat. Other kids had moms and dads. They had family picnics and matching holiday sweaters. We had takeout meals eaten in silence and old sitcoms on TV. But I never complained. In some strange way, it was enough. At least, for a time. High school was when things started to change. It wasn't sudden. It was more like a slow unraveling. First, I didn't even notice it. I got more involved with my friends, spent more time away from home, and started to distance myself from the routine Dad and I had shared for so many years. I thought it was normal, just part of growing up. Everyone was breaking away from their parents, testing boundaries, figuring out who they were. But for Dad, it was different. He didn't know how to handle it, how to let go. He tried to keep things the same, making me dinner when I was home, asking about school even though I barely answered. His life had always revolved around me, and as I pulled away, it was like he was losing his grip on the one thing that anchored him. He became more withdrawn, more silent, and the space between us grew wider every day. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. I was leaving him behind, piece by piece. The more I discovered the world outside, the more our life felt suffocating. I craved something different, something more than the constant hum of the TV in our small living room, more than the sight of Dad falling asleep on the couch after a long day of work. I began to resent the life we had, resent him for the sacrifices I never asked him to make, even though deep down, I knew I was being unfair. But fairness didn't matter to me then. All I saw was the narrowness of my life, and I wanted out. The final break came just before I left for college. I'd gotten a scholarship to a school on the other side of the country, and I took it without hesitation. The day I told Dad, I expected him to be proud, but instead, he just stared at me with those tired eyes of his. I'd never seen him look so lost, so broken. It was as though I'd taken something precious from him. In a way, I had. I was leaving him alone, for real this time, and I wasn't coming back. He didn't fight me on it, though. He never would have. He just nodded, his expression unreadable, and said, "If that's what you want." And that was that. No argument, no plea for me to stay. I think that hurt more than anything else, the quiet acceptance of it all. The day I left, he drove me to the airport in his beat-up truck. Neither of us spoke the entire way. I stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of our town blur into the distance. When we arrived, I grabbed my bags and got out. I turned to say goodbye, but Dad was already looking away, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I told myself I'd call, that I'd visit during breaks. But even then, I knew it was a lie. I wasn't coming back. College was everything I had imagined it would be. For the first time in my life, I felt free. I reinvented myself, shedding the quiet, reserved girl I'd been at home and becoming someone new. I made friends, joined clubs, threw myself into my studies, and for a while, I didn't think about Dad at all. I told myself he was fine, that he didn't need me. After all, he'd been alone before I came into his life. he'd figure it out again. But the calls became less frequent. First, I'd phone him every week, then every month, until eventually, the silence stretched so long that it felt too awkward to break. What would I even say? What would he say? We were living in two different worlds now, and mine didn't have room for him anymore. Time passed. Years. Actually, I graduated, got a job, and moved into a city apartment. Life was everything I dreamed of, fast-paced, exciting, full of possibility. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I'd feel a pang of guilt, a gnawing sense that I'd left something unfinished back home. But I ignored it, shoved it down deep, because facing it meant acknowledging the truth. I'd abandoned the one person who had never abandoned me. Then came the phone call. It was late, after a long day of work, and I was already half asleep when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick it up. It was a neighbor from back home. The details were blurry, but I remember the words. "Your dad's in the hospital." They said it had been an accident at work. Something about a faulty lift in the shop. I didn't listen to the rest. I flew back the next day. Walking into that hospital room felt like stepping into a memory I didn't want to relive. There he was, lying in the bed, looking smaller and frilier than I'd ever seen him. His face was pale, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. He didn't open his eyes when I entered the room. I stood there for a long time, just watching him, feeling the weight of all the time that had passed between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I realized, standing there, that I didn't know how to talk to him anymore. We were strangers now, connected only by blood and the years we'd shared under the same roof. He woke up briefly, and when his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition, but not much else. He smiled that same crooked, tired smile, and for a moment, I was a child again, sitting at the kitchen table while he made us dinner. But the moment passed, and the distance between us returned, greater than ever. He never fully recovered. I stayed for a while, helping where I could, trying to make up for the years I'd been gone. But it was too late. There was too much that had been left unsaid, too much time lost to ever bridge the gap. When he passed, it was quiet, just like everything else in his life had been. No fanfare, no grand goodbye, just a simple, final breath. And then he was gone. I stood at his grave, the wind cold against my skin, and I realized something that I hadn't understood before. I hadn't just abandoned my dad. I had abandoned the part of myself that was tied to him, the part that had grown up in that small, quiet house, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and the hum of an old TV. And leaving him behind, I'd left behind a piece of my own heart. The guilt lingers, heavy and unshakable, and I carry it with me, wherever I go. Sometimes, late at night, I can almost hear his voice, see the flicker of his smile, and for a moment, I'm home again. But then the moment fades, and I'm left with nothing but the weight of the choices I made, choices I can never take back.